Picture this. It is May 29th, 1933. We are in the port city of Jeddah. The heat is suffocating 105 degrees in the shade. Inside a mud brick palace, a finance minister is counting gold coins. 35,000 gold sovereigns, to be exact. The man sitting across from him isn't a king or a general. He represents a corporate empire based 8,000 miles away in San Francisco. At this moment, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is technically bankrupt. Pilgrimages to Mecca have dropped from 100,000 visitors to under 40,000 due to the Great Depression. King Abdulaziz ibn Saud is desperate. He needs funds to pay his tribal armies. So he signs a piece of paper. He grants a 60-year concession to explore for oil across 360,000 square miles of desert. The upfront cost for this massive gamble? Just £50,000. That signature didn't just save a kingdom. It planted the seed for the most profitable company in human history. But here is the detail most history books gloss over. The money didn't come from the U.S. government. It came from the Standard Oil Company of California, a direct offspring of the monopoly built by John D. Rockefeller. To understand why a gas station in Ohio affects a skyscraper in Riyadh today, we have to go back. We have to look at how the Rockefeller empire didn't just find oil. They unintentionally built a superpower that would one day hold the world hostage. Let's rewind the clock to 1911. The U.S. Supreme Court drops a hammer on John D. Rockefeller. They rule his company. Standard Oil is an illegal monopoly. They order it to shatter into 34 separate companies. You might know them today by different names. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. Breaking them up didn't break their ambition. It actually made them hungrier. By the late 1920s, these baby standards were in a frantic race. They needed new reserves to feed the exploding American auto industry. Car ownership in the U.S. jumped from 8 million in 1920 to 23 million in 1930. Standard Oil of California, let's call them SoCal, was desperate. They were locked out of the prime spots in Iraq and Iran by the British. They had nowhere to go, but the places nobody else wanted. That meant the tiny island of Bahrain and the massive unmapped desert across the water. Geologists called the Arabian Peninsula a graveyard. They said drilling there was setting money on fire. But SoCal took the bet anyway. They struck oil in Bahrain in 1932. That gave them the leverage to approach King Abdulaziz. The king was suspicious of foreigners, but his debt had climbed to £300,000. He couldn't pay his soldiers. SoCal offered a lifeline. The British tried to counterbid using paper rupees. The Americans offered gold. The king took the gold, and the Rockefeller legacy officially entered the Arabian Peninsula. Now the hard part began. SoCal set up a subsidiary. They called it CASOK, California Arabian Standard Oil Company. They sent a handful of geologists into the desert. Leading them was a man named Max Steineck. Remember that name. Steineck arrived in 1934. The conditions were brutal. Summer temperatures hit 125 degrees. Sandstorms stripped the paint off their cars in hours. They had no maps. They navigated the dunes by the stars, just like sailors. For 3 years, they drilled. They drilled Dammam No. 1. It failed. Dammam No. 2. It produced a little, then turned to water. No. 3 through No. 6 were all failures. The executives in San Francisco were panicking. They had sunk millions into the project with zero return. They told Steineck to pack up. They gave him one last shot. Steineck disobeyed the order to stop. He told his team to drill deeper on Dammam No. 7. He pushed the drill bit past 4,000 feet. The date was March 3, 1938. Suddenly, the ground shook. Oil didn't just flow. It roared. 1,585 barrels a day within weeks. Then 3,000, then 10,000. Damn 'em, no. 7 wasn't just a well. It was the taproot of the largest oil reservoir on Earth. SoCal realized they had a problem. They had found more oil than they could possibly sell or transport. They needed partners, and they knew exactly who to call. Here's where the business gets messy. The other Rockefeller companies, Exxon and Mobil, wanted in, but they were legally trapped. They had signed the Red Line Agreement back in 1928. This was a cartel deal with British and French oil companies. It said no partner could operate independently within the old Ottoman Empire. That included Saudi Arabia. SoCal wasn't part of that deal, but Exxon and Mobil were. They looked at the numbers coming out of Daman 07. They saw the potential for billions. So they launched a legal war to break the Red Line Agreement. They claimed the agreement was void because France fell to the Nazis in 1940. It took years of litigation. But by 1948, the deal was done. The ownership of the Saudi concession changed. It wasn't just SoCal anymore. It became the Arabian American Oil Company. You know it as Aramco. Here is the breakdown of the new ownership. SoCal, Chevron, kept 30%. Texaco took 30%. Exxon took 30%. Mobil took 10%. 3 of those 4 companies were direct descendants of John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil. They controlled 70% of Saudi Arabia's oil wealth. They didn't just export oil. They became the de facto government of eastern Saudi Arabia. They built railroads, ports, power grids, and schools. They even eradicated malaria in the region to keep their workers healthy. Aramco was a state within a state, run entirely by Americans. But tension was building. By 1950, the Saudis were waking up to the value of what they had. They looked at Venezuela. Venezuela had just passed a law demanding 50% of all oil profits. King Abdulaziz wanted the same deal. He demanded a 50-50th split. The American executives were terrified. If they paid 50% to the king and then paid U.S. corporate tax on the remainder, they would go broke. They faced a choice: refuse the king and lose the concession entirely, or find a loophole. They turned to the U.S. National Security Council. The Cold War was heating up. The U.S. government was terrified that Saudi Arabia might turn toward the Soviet Union. So the U.S. Treasury Department approved a unique arrangement. It's often called the Golden Gimmick. Here is the mechanism. The tax paid to the king, that new 50% share, would not be counted as a business expense. It would be counted as a foreign tax credit. This meant every dollar paid to the Saudi king was a dollar deducted directly from the taxes owed to the U.S. Treasury. Essentially, the U.S. taxpayers subsidized the Saudi monarchy. The transfer of wealth was immediate. In 1949, the Saudi royal treasury received $39 million. In 1951, after the deal, they received $110 million. The Rockefeller companies didn't lose a dime of profit. The U.S. government lost the tax revenue, and the Saudis got rich. This deal cemented the alliance. For the next 20 years, this machine printed money. Production hit 1 million barrels a day in 1958, then 4 million in 1970. The barrel price stayed low around $1.80. The Americans were happy. The Saudis were getting richer. But the balance of power was about to shift violently. Fast forward to October 1973. The Yom Kippur War breaks out. Israel is fighting Egypt and Syria. The U.S. sends military aid to Israel. King Faisal is now in charge of Saudi Arabia. He is not like his father. He is savvy, educated, and tired of being a junior partner. He decides to use the oil weapon. On October 17, 1973, the Arab oil producers announce a total embargo against the United States. The panic was instant. The price of oil quadrupled. It went from $3 per barrel to nearly $12 overnight. In the U.S., gas stations ran dry. Speed limits were lowered to 55 miles per hour to save fuel. But for Aramco, it was complicated. The American partners Exxon, Mobil, Chevron were in a bind. They were American companies, but they had to carry out the king's orders. They cut off the U.S. Navy's fuel supply at the king's command. They effectively enforced the embargo against their own country. Why? Because they knew if they didn't, they would lose the concession forever. This moment proved who really held the cards. The money flooding into Saudi Arabia was now astronomical. In 1972, Saudi oil revenue was $2.7 billion. By 1974, it was $22.6 billion. That is an increase of 730% in 2 years. This was the greatest transfer of wealth in human history, and the Saudis used it to buy the company. The Saudis didn't seize the company like Castro did in Cuba or Mossadegh tried in Iran. They were smarter than that. They knew they still needed American technology, so they bought Aramco in slices. It was a negotiated takeover. In 1973, the Saudi government bought a 25% stake. In 1974, they bumped it to 60%. By 1980, they owned 100%. The company was renamed Saudi Aramco in 1988. The Rockefeller companies Exxon, Mobil, Chevron were paid out. They received billions in compensation, but they lost ownership of their reserves. They went from being the landlords to being the contractors. So, did the Rockefellers lose? Not exactly. They had extracted 40 years of massive profits with very little capital investment after the initial discovery. They used that capital to build global empires of their own. ExxonMobil is today worth over $400 billion. Chevron is worth over $300 billion. But Saudi Aramco? When it finally went public in 2019, it was valued at $1.7 trillion. It became the most valuable company on earth instantly. That value was built on the infrastructure laid down by Max Steinig and the Standard Oil engineers. Let's look at the physical reality of Saudi Arabia today. The footprints of Standard Oil are everywhere. The town of Dhahran, where Aramco is headquartered, looks like a suburb of California. It has baseball fields. It has movie theaters. It has ranch-style houses. This was built by the Americans in the 1940s. The tap line, the Trans-Arabian Pipeline, was built by American steel. It stretched 1,068 miles from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. When it was finished in 1950, it was the world's largest private construction project. It cost $200 million. The Rockefeller companies paid for it. This infrastructure unlocked the oil that built the modern Saudi state. Without that initial risk capital from SoCal, Saudi Arabia might have remained a poor desert kingdom for decades longer. But there is a flip side to this legacy. The resource curse. Because the wealth came so easily once the Americans tapped it, the Saudi economy became one-dimensional. For decades, 90% of the government's budget came from oil. The population became dependent on subsidies. There was no income tax. Gasoline cost 12 cents a gallon. This social contract was purchased with the petrodollars generated by American engineering. This relationship created a strange geopolitical marriage. The U.S. guarantees Saudi security. Saudi Arabia guarantees oil supply and prices oil in U.S. dollars. This is the petrodollar system. It kept the U.S. dollar as the world reserve currency. And it started with that handshake in 1933. But the dynamic has shifted again. The U.S. is now the world's largest oil producer, thanks to fracking technology. Our imports from Saudi Arabia have dropped from 2 million barrels a day in 2003 to under 500,000 today. Yet, the relationship persists. Why? Because Saudi Aramco, the company built by Rockefeller's heirs, is the central bank of oil. They are the only producer with significant spare capacity. If they turn the taps on, prices crash. If they turn them off, prices spike. We saw this in 2020. When the pandemic hit, demand collapsed. Saudi Arabia flooded the market. Oil prices went negative for the first time in history. It bankrupted dozens of American oil companies. It was a brutal reminder of their power. The child had grown up to dominate the parent. So, let's return to the core question. Are the Rockefellers behind Saudi Arabia's wealth? If you mean, do they control it today? The answer is no. The Saudi state has absolute sovereignty. They call the shots. They set the prices. But if you mean, are they the architects? Then the answer is a definitive yes. Standard Oil of California put up the money. Standard Oil geologists found the oil. Standard Oil lawyers wrote the contracts. Standard Oil engineers built the pipelines. And the corporate structure of the Rockefeller breakup created the competition that drove them there. It is a direct line of cause and effect. John D. Rockefeller never set foot in Arabia, but his business philosophy, ruthless efficiency, and global scale is the blueprint for Saudi Aramco. Saudi Aramco is essentially Standard Oil 2.0. It is just bigger, richer, and state-owned. The $2 trillion valuation of that company is the legacy of that 50,000 pounds loan in 1933. It is the highest return on investment in the history of finance. But here is where it gets interesting for the future. The world is moving away from oil. Saudi Arabia sees the writing on the wall. They are taking the wealth generated by that American infrastructure and pivoting. They are investing $500 billion into Neom, a futuristic city in the desert. They are buying stakes in Nintendo, Uber, and Lucid Motors. They are trying to turn oil wealth into post-oil power. And guess who is helping them? American consultants, American bankers, American tech firms. The players have changed, but the dynamic is similar. Western expertise meeting Saudi capital. Only now, the Saudis are the ones writing the checks. They aren't asking for loans of gold sovereigns anymore. They are the ones lending the money. So next time you look at the gas pump prices, or you see a headline about the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund buying a sports team, remember the year 1933. Remember Max Steinich sweating in the desert, disobeying orders to stop drilling. Remember the Dammam, no, 7 well. History isn't just names and dates. It's a chain reaction. The breakup of an American monopoly in 1911 sent shockwaves that are still shaping the Middle East in 2025. The Rockefellers lit the match, but the fire they started has burned far longer and hotter than they ever imagined. It created a kingdom. It shifted the center of gravity of the global economy. And it left us with a world where the flow of energy is still dictated by the decisions made in that desert 90 years ago. Which brings us to the big question for the next decade. Saudi Arabia is betting everything on Vision 2030 to move beyond the oil wealth the Rockefellers helped create. Do you think they can pull it off? Or is the resource curse too strong to break? I want to see your prediction. Comment success or failure below and tell me why. And if you want to understand how other corporate empires shaped national borders, hit that subscribe button. We are going to revisit this prediction in 2030 to see who was right. Thanks for watching.